Juano is from Chile. Yep. Uh, I am originally from Chile, and some of my earliest experiences were in the rocky shores or in the coastal areas gathering seafood. So I've got a strong connection to the sea and to the resources that the sea provides. And I didn't think much about that and continuing my career. I did most of my university degrees in the US. And I was always very drawn to sort of ecology, especially marine ecology. So I ended up with a career in marine ecology. And then about 26 years ago, I came to New Zealand and I had been trained as a marine ecologist, but I found out that here in New Zealand, you need to have applied research. So the application of marine ecology was aquaculture. So I formed the Aquaculture Biotechnology Research Group, which I lead to today. And this group is very, very connected to the aquaculture industry. We pretty much work with all the major aquaculture companies and providers in the country and with many communities in trying to understand, again, that connection to the seafood that the ocean provides. So today I want to talk a little bit about indigenous aquaculture and the knowledge and practices that underpin indigenous aquaculture and some potential opportunities for future and sustainability. So one of the things that has always amazed me, and I had the privilege of going to see a talk by an astronaut a long time ago. And one of the things that stuck in my mind was when she was talking about her experience of flying or navigating around our planet and seeing our world from the outside, and how she explained the fact that this is our only home at the moment, and how fragile this is, and how unique this opportunity to live in this planet is for all of us. And that really stuck and resonated with me. And the other thing that she mentioned was, how it is blue because most of it is ocean, and all that you see is the ocean, and how unique it is to have a planet that has all of that ocean. And yet we live in these bits of land that are scattered in this planet, and we keep growing and using those resources from the land, which with very minimal exploration of the seas. And the other thing that it's obviously in my mind a lot is this idea that we are overpopulating the land. And we keep growing and keep growing, utilizing these land resources. And at some point, and we are looking at the seas now, but it's that looking to the seas is going to intensify, and aquaculture is at the heart of that. So currently we're consuming about 70 grams of meat, land meat per person per day. And that's a huge amount of meat, protein, mostly coming from land. That beef production is supposed to, and the consumption is supposed to increase by 76% to feed the estimated 9.7 billion people that we're supposed to be by the year 2050. That's a huge amount of protein needed to support ourselves as we grow. And it's clear to most scientists, I think, that land-based animal production cannot sustain that kind of demand. So we have to look at the oceans to provide that protein that we're going to need in the future. There are many reasons why seafood is important, and it is a growing industry. Seafood now at the moment it's growing exponentially to a rate of 2.4% per annum, and that's excluding China, which, as you will see in a minute, is a massive producer and consumer of seafood. So at the moment, it's estimated that our seafood consumption is it's over 20 kgs per capita. And I eat a lot more seafood than that, so someone's going without. But There are many different reasons why seafood is a good source of protein for us. It has many health benefits. We know, and it's been shown that seafood has an ability to provide healthy brains. It's an important provides important components that allow us to have healthy brains, as well as a healthy heart and circulatory system. And also it's a very important for building strong bones and muscle in our bodies. There are many other reasons why seafood is a good thing for us to be consuming rather than animal seafood. I don't know if you can see my pointer here. Can you see my pointer? Yes. So you can see here that this is a comparison in terms of CO2 emissions, and seafood um, is a very small source of CO2 emissions compared to land-based animals. Also, the feed conversion ratio, so meaning the amount of feed that is needed to produce a kilogram of animal is much lower for seafood compared to especially things like beef. So to produce 1.2 kgs of salmon, for example, to produce a 1 kg amount of salmon, you need 1.2 kgs of feed compared to 6.9 for beef. So this is a very unsustainable way of producing meat for us to eat. There are many other reasons why aquaculture is better than land-based animal cultivation, and that's in many countries we have a limitation or a problem with fresh water supply. Well, aquaculture uses a lot, like in orders of magnitude less fresh water than land-based production. And there are other reasons, like the fact that it requires less area to produce seafood than animals on land. So seafood is great. It's a growing industry. It's important for us. It's healthy for us. It's more sustainable. But clearly fisheries is not sustainable. And at the moment, it's estimated that fisheries accounts for 2.5 times more than what the oceans can actually produce naturally. So this is not a sustainable way of gathering or acquiring seafood. And if we look at the trends between fisheries and aquaculture, in the 90s, they were both growing really well, but clearly soon they started differentiating. And at the moment, we've got and so fisheries has begun to decline. And that's because we're using up all of those resources. We are depleting those natural resources, but aquaculture continues to increase dramatically. And at the moment where we are at now, aquaculture produces more than half of the seafood that for human consumption, and you will see that that will only intensify in the coming years. So aquaculture is a more sustainable way of producing seafood than fisheries. That's no questions about that. It is the fastest growing food sector, and it's the most traded food commodity at the moment. So this is an area of expansion. So what about where the seafood is produced? And you can see here in this graph that China produces the majority of seafood with 60%, but Asia in general produces 92% of our seafood, which is a huge amount. And there's huge opportunities for Indonesia, which is an up and coming country in terms of seafood production. Sorry, you'll be happy to know that. And then followed by India and Vietnam and other countries. So there's a huge opportunity for other countries to have a piece of this pie in the future years. So why has Asia been so successful? And one of the reasons for that is that it is an ancient tradition. Usually it was on land over 2,000 years ago. There's evidence of cultivation. And it has been, especially in the rice paddies where fish has been co-cultured with rice paddies. And there's been a historical sense that it's a low, low labor costs have contributed to this, and a growing population and the need for that kind of protein has allowed for this kind of aquaculture to continue to increase. And specifically the rice, what they call the rice fish systems. It's a really interesting system where rice paddies, because rice needs inundation, that water provides a really good environment for fish, for example, to be co-cultivated. And the fish themselves can, find shelter and shade among the rice plants, and also insects that they can feed on and so forth. And this tradition is intergenerational, and it's very much present in throughout Asia, especially in India, Thailand, Vietnam, and of course China, with massive productions that continue to evolve. In fact, there's a lot of diversification and intensification of this kind of system, with some of these paddies having really, really long raceways of shrimp production, for example, where the rice is co-cultivated with very good and a symbiotic relationship, if you will. And the rice paddies can be cultivated with fish, with shrimp, with crabs, turtles, etc. And studies have shown very clearly that these rice paddies that are cultivated with animals have a 12% higher rice yields, and they have less weeds and pests. So it makes sense to have these sort of systems approach to cultivation. And yes, population in Asia has been growing, and so has aquaculture. And this is an example of kelp and abalone farms in Fujian and the coast of China. And you can see that all of that is just kilometers and kilometers of farms of kelp and abalone, and the kelp are used to feed the abalone. In fact, for every one abalone farm, which is one of those little squares, there's 4 kelp farms to feed the abalone, and for other, of course, seafood products. I was actually at a conference, an abalone symposium, quite a few years ago in Xiamen, China, and we went to a field trip that was in the north, so we traveled around the coast on a bus, and for 3 hours I looked out the window and all I saw were farms as far as my eye could see. All of that area was completely covered with farms at that stage. So the end product of this is a globalization of seafood systems based on aquaculture and international markets. Now, the difference with the traditional aquaculture is that these systems tend to be monoculture. They specifically focus on one cultivation at a time, and they're mass productions to supply mass populations. And the other thing is that there are many technological advances that go hand in hand with the aim to increase that production, to speed up the growth rates, to make it as efficient as possible, especially in China. So some of the technology that has been developed are these, for example, these ships that collect these are abalone cages, the ones that I showed you in the previous slide. And they have these massive cargo ship with swimming pools that they fill with these cages. They increase the water level, and then slowly they transport all of these cages to warmer waters to increase the growth rate, and then they move down, and these are farms that find the right warmth conditions to increase the growth rate. This is an example of the modern farms. This is a massive ship for scale, and these are gigantic aquaculture platforms where they cultivate various things that could actually move around to find best conditions for growing whatever they're growing, in this case, fish. So it's a global movement, if you will. But one of the things that COVID-19 showed us, which was really quite shocking for most people, is that it shook our confidence in the security and reliability of the centralized food system. So people weren't getting their seafood, and that was a big problem that kind of, shook a lot of people. And there are other things like climate change and the global impacts that climate change is having and will continue to have, which create a big question mark as to this kind of production, massive production. And of course, as Sari was mentioning earlier, there's all kinds of equity and diversity issues that are unaccounted in these processes. So that leads me to indigenous aquaculture and an interest that I've had, and it's a full circle to my original years and growing up in Chile. But I've been doing a lot of study on this sort of on my own. And one of the things that I find interesting is that indigenous aquaculture is extensive worldwide. And everywhere you go and you find indigenous people in the coastlines, they have had some kind of a relationship with the ocean and the products that the ocean provides. And it's got a very long history. So what is indigenous aquaculture? And I think there isn't really a formal definition, and for me it's all encompassing in terms of sea hunters, sea gatherers, sea ranchers and farmers. Anything that has to do with the sea, I'm calling indigenous aquaculture, just because there's no real definition or study. It is considered a craft and not in many places artisanal production. It does have some innovation, but it tends to be more about using different kinds of natural environment or products or structures in the environment. And it's considered to be low technology, but some of that technology is quite innovative in terms of using products like baskets and seaweed bladders to keep things, seafood fresh and so on. However, in general, we can say that is undervalued, understudied, and unrecognized for most parts of the world. So that has gotten me really interested. And I've realized that actually there is a persistence of these indigenous knowledge, and there's a local value and a local impact. And how does that translate? Well, these communities this aquaculture, indigenous aquaculture tends to be a transgenerational aspect. It has traditions, customs, and cultures, and an identity that people feel connected to those coastal areas. There's food security and usually some local economy as well. There's a connectivity with health and well-being, which, Bertha was talking about earlier. And in general, there's a sense of conservation and sustainability because we have that intimate relationship with what we're eating, what we're gathering and eating. And the other thing is that there's a commonality that is the system that can enhance the natural production of seafood while actually conserving the ecosystem and the resources that it's forming part of. Another thing that I have been realizing is that many of these cultivations use non-permanent structures or flexible structures that can easily respond to changes in the environment. So you can build a structure to fish or to gather the food, then a hurricane comes and throws everything away, collapses everything. And now you've got a flexibility to create something that perhaps has an innovation to be better next time or to adapt to the new conditions. So now I want to give you some examples of a few places that have indigenous aquaculture that I find really fascinating. This one here is of ancient clam gardens that is practiced along the coast of Alaska and British Columbia by indigenous people, and these are called lohewe. They are gardens where clams are cultivated. And one of the things that I found really interesting is that some of these communities have been under a lot of pressure by government legislations and regulations about how much you can fish, and and considered sport fishing or recreational fishing. And these communities have been fishing for consumption, for traditions, and so they're being prevented from gathering the seafood, and they're being told that they have to follow these Western, rules and regulations. And some of these tribes have gone back and said, well, actually, we can't follow those rules because we already have a contract with the land. Our contract that we signed generations ago was that we could cultivate in these coastal areas as much as we wanted to, as long as we were enhancing the biomass and the ecosystem that they were part of. And we're doing just that. So we can enter into your contracts, which I find really fascinating. So you can see these mittens on the coastal areas where these clams were farmed or cultivated. And these have been aged to 3,500 years old. So they're very, very old. And you can find clams there today. There are about 6 different species that are commonly found. And recent studies have shown that those gardens have 4 times more clams than adjacent areas. So it's a really good way to enhance the population of clams while still being able to harvest them. So how do they do that? Well, it's really fascinating. These low hay waves the name actually means rolled together and low tide. And these communities used to go to the coast and pick up the clams and then pick up a rock, probably about basketball size, and they would roll the rocks down. And wherever they ended up, which was usually at the low tide like that, they would start forming these walls, these walls in here. And as the tide came up and down, it would actually deposit sand in these areas, effectively creating a platform or a terrace of sand that was really had more water and nutrients in them. There was more permeability and more accumulation of nutrients that were the perfect environment for growing these clams. The other thing that they would do is they would only collect the large clams and they would always return the shells back to the environment. And those clams would actually break apart and then form shell hash, which was a coarser sediment, which was perfect for the juveniles to be able to survive there. And the other thing, because there was so much calcium carbonate from the shells, they're finding out now that this environment's much better to combat ocean acidification, and that the juveniles are able to survive just fine in this environment despite of the climate change environment. And the other example I want to share with you is that of fish ponds. This is in Hawaii. These are traditionally bays, and what they used to do is form these walls, these usually stone walls to enclose these bays. These areas are called loko'i'a, or fish ponds. They're 800 years old, and it's a natural estuary, as I said, where they grow fresh herbivorous fish. What's interesting about this is that they also had this whole cultivation system in the watershed and these areas called ahupua'a, which are land parcels, where they would grow taro with fish in a co-cultivation. And the interesting thing is that they had the fresh water that would come down from the mountains would irrigate these kalo or taro ponds, and then the nutrient-rich water from these cultivation areas would then be channeled down to the coastal loko'i'a, where the fresh water, rich in nutrient, would attract fish, and they would have these gates where the fish would come in, and that water would mix with seawater, creating a brackish water that was perfect for these fish to survive in. And so they've been now studying, well, can this environment survive climate change, sea level rise, and changes in the hydraulic? Sometimes it doesn't rain for a long time. These weather patterns are changing, and can these traditional systems work in future climate conditions? It's an area that is still being investigated. This is an example of traditional seafood in Chile. You may be familiar with the canoes or the waka that Maori used to use to navigate the seas for months and months or years sometimes, where entire families used to live in these areas. Well, there's a big connection between New Zealand, Maori, and Chilean indigenous people. And especially in the south of Chile, where the mountain, the Andes, actually dives and kind of goes into the sea, there's actually no land left. There's just a mountain side on the ocean side, and lots and lots and lots of islands. And these people used to live in the canoes their entire lives in these waka, and they would just move around and go to different resources to fish in a sustainable manner. So they would know they would fish here for this species, and then they would go over there. And that's how they managed the seafood that they lived off of. Now that's pretty much gone. That whole tradition is, there's very little evidence of that now. And what is there now is these areas where fishermen, local artisanal fisheries, have small boats and they go out fishing. And you know, it's kind of a modernized way of looking or finding these resources. And the example that I want to give is this one of the loco, which is this large snail on the right. I don't know if you can see me, but this is a loco from Chile. This is a medium-sized one. They used to be much larger, but they've been overfished. Now you can only find them as these smaller ones. These snails are similar to abalone, but very ancient snails, but they're not in the same family. And then the other thing that they would harvest is this seaweed, and the seaweed they would actually dry and use it during times where there wasn't enough seaweed, and they would leave the natural seaweed for the animals to graze on and eat the stored seaweed. So they had a good way of managing those resources. And at the moment, there are these coastal areas are called caletas, or areas where they manage them in the traditional ways. And they are trying to manage this loco, which is a delicacy in Chile, but unfortunately is suffering overfishing and habitat loss. So these are the local fisheries that are now gathering small amounts. And this is my favorite seafood that we were sharing earlier. This is a loco dish, cooked in a traditional way. Quite delicious, but I don't know if sometimes people think it's an acquired taste. Anyway, so what are the threats now? Well, there's, you know, large scale commercial aquaculture in Chile is a boom. You know, Chile is one of the top producers of seafood now. Massive, massive salmon farms with all kinds of environmental problems. And they also introduced 2 species of abalone, which are not native of the area, and they're growing them by harvesting seaweed and putting them into these cages for export. And the abalone industry in Chile is the 10th largest in the world now, and it's all based on this introduced 2 species that they cultivate. So some of the problems that they're facing now is future threats due to the salmon farms. There's lots of diseases, pollution. It's an unregulated environment, unlike New Zealand. You know, there's no one actually patrols these, or you know, there are no consequences for people not doing the right thing. It's unknown how many of these. Well, the abalone has now been introduced in the wild, and it's unknown the impact that they're having in the wild environments. And there's also depletion of the kelp, which is now the kelp forests are being depleted, and now there's erosion on land and loss of ecosystems. And also the communities that used to depend on these seafood are finding it difficult to find that. And there's lots of fights with governments and aquaculture industries, and pretty much loss of traditions regarding these foods, cultural identities being lost. And, you know, it's a sad story, and it's very different from what's happening in New Zealand. But yeah, so that one is unfortunately a bit too late. So what's the future for indigenous aquaculture? And is there a future, and is there a space in this globalized system? And I think that there's definitely a mechanism to uplift communities. For example, this is an example of women co-ops in Kiribati and Zanzibar, where the UN and governments have come in and put in programs to help these women, especially to cultivate seaweed. There were lots of gender inequity in there, a lot of violence and um, discrimination, and women were really suffering. The men were traditionally the ones who earned the living by fishing and in the copra coconut plantations, and the women didn't really have ownership of anything, and they were very much abused. And so this program was intended to enhance their livelihood and their status in the community by having them cultivate seaweed. And the seaweeds are used for things like carrageenan, alginates, and agar, which make up just about so many products, from toothpaste to creams. They're included in all of these kinds of products that we use every day. And so these women, what they do is they pick up pieces of the seaweed and they tie it to these ropes, which then they cultivate in these lagoons, and they have these stakes, and they just do it as a cooperative of women, so they have support among themselves, and then they also earn some money so that they can actually be self-sufficient. So what that has created is a uplifting of women in those areas. So some of the critical questions that I see of our times with regards to indigenous aquaculture are questions that I pose myself. Can indigenous aquaculture survive in these times of globalization? Can indigenous aquaculture systems continue to, in light of all of these anthropogenic effects that we're having in the environment or causing in the environment, and can these systems perhaps be used as tools to help communities adapt and mitigate some climate change, which would be really valuable, I think. However, we need to understand that there are some limitations. Some of those limitations are very obvious, or well, maybe not so obvious, but for me, I think indigenous aquaculture can feed a community, but not the planet. These practices don't scale up. They really depend on communities, and they help communities be self-sufficient, self-reliant. And it can be a way to alleviate the global, the pressure from global or large scale food productions, in a way helping to improve sustainability in the future. And I guess I want to finish up with an example of my own research here in New Zealand in paua and its ecosystem. Paua is a Tonga species, very important for Maori. It's also considered a tohu or environmental indicator. It is an indicator of the health of the environment. It's recognized that there's a special relationship between paua and the rimu, which is the seaweed that it consumes, and a connection to the rivers and the catchments that bring the nutrients down for the rimu to grow, and then the paua to eat. So some of the communities that we've worked with see this paua as in a holistic approach. So the holistic view that it's not just the paua, but it's the environment that we need to look at. No, we cannot think of the paua by itself as its own species, but it's the ecosystem. And also they think of the paua as a human entity. Traditionally, the paua is like a brother or a cousin or sister. And it has, because of that sense, we say karakia, and we harvest only what we need. We consume all the seafood that it provides. And then the shells are used in the carvings, which is a process called tifaya. And it's said that when the carver finishes the carving, then the shell is put on the eyes, and that brings life to the carving. So it has a whole narrative around conservation and sustainability and the implications of harvesting just what you need. So in our work, and we work across many different iwi and hapua across New Zealand and the South and North Island. And in order to do that, we've created this Manaya framework with some of my previous Māori students, where you've got a temporal chart here. Here we are in the present. And in order to look at the future, we need to look at the past. And by understanding the present, past, and future, we can actually understand what the ideal would be in an environment. And so this Māori framework, we use to put Western science, interweave it with Western science, and we apply it to the power and the ecosystem and the research that we do. And then, in Western science, we use a scientific method, but Māori use observations of the environment, our understanding of the environment or the problem, the tools that we have available, and then that informs our actions and management practices. And all of that can be intertwined or put into the context of power and how we need to use our knowledge and our views of the past and the future to achieve this balanced ecosystem holistically, where the power is at the center, but it's part of a whole ecosystem. And we're using Mātauranga Māori and Western science integrated really, really at the core of everything that we do. I could go on and on, but I will stop there because it's more complicated, but that's where we are. That's what's informing our roadmap for research. So some of the communities in the Chatham Islands, where over 40% of the power fisheries comes from, we're experiencing what we call a marine heat wave event a few years back, where the water was warming up so much that we had massive mortalities of power. And they didn't know if there was a disease or a thermal stress. And they wanted us to come and study that with Western science and try to understand what was going on. So we went and we applied all of our tools that we have in our kitty to understand. I won't get into the methodology, but I will tell you about the conclusions. We found that there wasn't any major disease that you could see, but we did see that there was a lower nutritional state in all of these populations. Some of these populations were stunted, which indicated that they were being starved for a long period of time. And then that they were all very much depleted in terms of their nutritional state, and that the seaweeds were being depleted as well. So in conclusion, we found that there was a direct thermal effect on the power, but also an indirect malnutrition effect that was going on for a long time, probably an effect of warming waters that were also depleting the seaweed. And so the whole ecosystem was collapsing. And we found out that that was happening in other parts of the country. And so we hosted the 11th International Abalone Symposium here at AUT. And this is a conference that usually covers aquaculture and fisheries with experts from all around the world. And this time, for the first time in this history of the conference, we included a cultural and Indigenous knowledge section. And a lot of these Māori communities and Indigenous people from all other countries came and participated. And we had a wananga at the beginning where we talked all about Indigenous ways of looking at the power. It was so successful that they called us to many of these communities to build a program because they realized that in light of climate change, they couldn't actually rely solely on Indigenous knowledge, that they needed the help of Western science, but they needed to do that within the concept of Mātauranga Māori. So what we're doing now is we've got some tools to build resilient power, to build power that are more thermally tolerant to make sure that it survives climate change. And we do that with a whole bunch of genetic and epigenetic tools, as well as some environmental inducers like the right nutrition and the right components in the diet for the power to survive. So this is sort of a context that we use in our lab. And we also have been working on diets, innovative diets. So we've discovered some key bioactives in some of the seaweeds that then we can actually include in these encapsulated feeds that we use in aquaculture farms. And all of this technology has been helping us to build a resilient, or to develop a resilient power. But how do we apply that? Well, the idea is to apply it in a rohe environment. So in a coastal area like a Mataitai or Taipei, or an area that is being managed by Maori. The idea is that we build this, in a hatchery, we produce these resilient power. We put them in these cages in the coastal environment, and we also cultivate some seaweeds that then can be planted into the rohe to enhance the habitat. And then we also plant some of them in the rohe itself. And these seaweeds can be clipped. And by clipping them, you're actually pruning them so that they actually grow faster. And the seaweed can then, that is harvested, can be used to feed the paua in the cages. This is an example of the types of cages. You only need to feed them every 3 weeks, and they get covered with seaweeds themselves, and you can clip all of that and put it inside the cages. And the paua just love it. They just eat all of that. And so these juveniles that would not survive in the wild because they're not acclimated yet, they have an opportunity to acclimate inside the cages, protected from predators, being fed the right seaweed that they're going to encounter in the environment outside. And you can see them inside these cages here, growing to a certain size. We also provide these discs, which create areas for them to hide in, and then we can take those discs out and clip them in the rohe, in the rocks, and they naturally just disperse, and they just re-enhance and restock the environment, the rohe that is managed, but there's spillover effects for fisheries nearby as well. So this is, I'm finishing now. I don't know how much time I have, but anyway, this is the rohe-based management system that we are developing. So it's Western science with Maturanga Maori, Indigenous knowledge, and Kaiti Akitanga. So we produce the paua juveniles in the hatchery. They're seeded into these cages, and this whole management system is done with traditional knowledge. We plant these seaweeds that we also have a nursery for. And then with Maori communities, we work on a model that actually determines how much seed you're putting in and how much, not just paua, but other species can be harvested from the ecosystem. If the sea urchins come in and start eating too much seaweed, then it's time to harvest some of the kina or the paua or other species. So they manage their ecosystem from a holistic point of view, looking at what's the best balance to sustain it for the future. Any extra seed that we can produce from the hatchery can go into these paua grow out farms, and that's a source of economic gain for the communities. And with the formulated feeds that we've developed, we can actually increase the growth rate much faster, because we're also including some bioactives that are coming from the seaweed. So yeah, in conclusion, I think indigenous aquaculture can coexist with large-scale commercial aquaculture. there's also an important, these communities can innovate very quickly and they can adapt very quickly because they have that historical knowledge about their environment. And that's the best knowledge to make sure that whatever you do has the best chance of success. Traditional knowledge and practices need to be preserved and valorized. And I think that's one thing that is not happening throughout the world. New Zealand's ahead of its time, but that's not the case in many other countries around the world. And then finally, I think that combining traditional knowledge with education and economic practices really can help preserve these traditions, especially for young Indigenous people who see that, Western world is got more opportunities, more economics, and so on. If you can engage them with this educational process and making sure that they're still connected to these natural environments and practices while producing some economic value so that they can survive, I think those practices can be preserved into the future. And I just want to thank my group of very diverse people from all over the world who come in and work with us and the communities and the industries that we are part of. So namihi, and I will end there. I have no idea what time it was or what, but anyway, that's what I have to share with you.